what do you think is a better compliment? You smell good or you look good?
Oh, hands down, you smell good.
Right?
Hands down.
Right?
It's not even close for me. Because my style is pretty simple, you know? I mean, I don't like to kind of think about it. I mean, shout out to, you know, the guys and girls who like really put their effort into fashion.
Yes.
But my effort is into like feeling good.
Mm.
And what makes me feel good is fragrance.
I
And
love
it's
that.
always been like that.
Let's go quickly through your modeling career. How did you
Mhm.
become a model? Because I know that's a foundational moment.
Yeah.
That moment you became a model kind of changed trajectories from
Yes.
perhaps being pre-med and being a doctor or a
Yeah.
psychologist.
Mhm.
So tell us about that catalyst for change for you when you entered the world of modeling and the world of fashion.
Well, I mean, I was always kind of open to um like directions changing.
Hmm.
So even though, you know, I was focused on, you know, whatever I did it properly,
Right.
right? But I was always open to like what the possibilities were with other things. So you know, I don't believe in chance. I think everything happens for a reason. You know, there's some
Mhm.
sort of divine intervention that happens through all our lives.
Yes.
And when I was a senior in college, I was in the right place at the right time. And I met this agent and he said, well, have you ever thought about modeling? You know, and back then, you know, I was younger and more handsome. So I was like, yeah, you know.
Still handsome.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I was
Still handsome.
searching for a
Sorry to my
compliment.
husband.
Uh, but um, no, I never really thought about modeling because, you know, again, I got to be a doctor because smart
Right.
people have to do. So I said, you know what? I'm going to take a year off before I go on to, you know, either graduate school because I was considering physical therapy or medical school, sports medicine. I said, let me take a year off and see what happens. And that year turned into 25 years
What?
and an incredible career working with Ralph Lauren. And, you know, you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans, and there will be something else that's going to come up and happen. And, you know, I learned a lot from being in the business and it helped me, you know, with my brand as well. So it was
Absolutely.
all
So
worth it.
let me give you your flowers right quick. You had a modeling career that lasted over 25 years, which is an amazing feat. Um, you worked full time with Ralph Lauren and you appeared in over 60 campaigns and you became an iconic face. I'm not going to lie, I did recognize you.
Oh,
I was like, when I saw you, I was like, I've seen this face before.
hmm,
And you just became a really big, iconic face for the brand.
right.
And I'm sure, as you mentioned before, there's a lot that you've learned
Yeah.
throughout those experiences, and you've definitely segued into a kind of different realm.
Hmm.
But if there's one thing you learned from those 25 years and 60 campaigns,
Mm.
what is something that you've taken with you
Oh,
to this day? Is there anything that you've carried through?
I mean, so many things, but you know, the the concept of like Ralph Lauren
Hmm.
um was genius because here's this guy from the Bronx who had this idea
Hmm.
like to create this brand, and it was kind of like this exclusive um yet attainable
Right.
kind of world. And his bestseller, I mean, he has so many amazing, you know, designs and fashion lines and all kind of stuff. But his bestseller was, you know, a polo shirt with a polo player right on your chest, on your heart,
Iconic.
iconic. And the genius of that was, if I wear that shirt,
Hmm.
then I'm part of this fraternity
Yeah,
of luxury.
absolutely.
And that was his genius. It was like, okay, I don't sell shirts. I don't sell perfume.
Hmm.
I sell this idea of luxury and,
Yeah.
you know, of wealth and, you know, confidence, opulence.
It's like you get a piece of it. And I think you've said this many times before. Like,
Right.
fragrance and, fashion, your point about Ralph Lauren, is
Right.
it gives you this little piece of luxury,
That's right.
and it allows you to live an experience in this world that might not be hyper present in your life, but it gives you the feeling.
But it gives you the feeling. So that's, if there was only one thing that I took from that experience, and that was the most important.
Mm-hmm.
I need to create fragrances that make people feel worthy, confident, luxurious. Yeah.
That's it.
That's
it. And scent, I feel like, is one of the few categories or things, for lack of a better word, that can actually give that to you really easily. It's
attainable.
accessible.
It's accessible. Yeah. It's
you
100%.
might not be able to have the Dior fragrance or the Dior ball gown that was worn at the Met Gala.
Right.
But you could get that fragrance.
And I got news for you. People may not even remember that you wore the gown.
That's true.
But if you walk past them and they smelled you, they're going to say, who is that?
Exactly. It's a head turner.
Yeah. It's an attention grabber for sure.
Absolutely.
But, you wear fragrance for you first so you can enjoy it.
I know that you grew up in Paterson, New Jersey,
Mm-hmm.
and you say that early on fragrance became a big part of your life. Could you take us to your first scent moments?
Well, I think I was about 5 or 6 years old when my dad indirectly introduced me into what my love affair would become of, and that's, fragrance. He wore all like the old school 70s fragrances, like gray flannel, which in particular that one was the one that like grabbed me. And then, he had like the English leathers, and he had like all the old school ones. But, it was kind of that feeling of like familiarity.
Mm-hmm.
I knew he was home, when I smelled him when he came home. And, my dad was like, into his grooming before I knew what grooming was. I was, my job was to put lotion on his back when he finished taking a shower. And I remember my hands were like this big and his back was like this big. And it just felt like I was doing it for like an hour. And then he would go through his routine and put on his fragrance and all that. So, those are my first scent memories. And, they actually, I carried them all the way through, because then as I got older, I started to kind of, create my own kind of stance and what I liked and what I wore, but always kind of going back to, the first
what
time.
you learned.
What I learned, yeah.
So I heard you were known as the guy that smells good.
Yes.
And you wore Calvin Klein Obsession. Is that correct?
Yes. That was so when I was 12, I got my 14, I got my first job. And the first thing I went to go buy was, I went to Macy's, right? And I was like, okay, I can't afford the shoes. I can't afford all these clothes. But let me go and see like what the cologne or the fragrance, I thought it was cologne back then, but what all the fragrances smell like. And then I came across Obsession for Men.
Her fingers went over the mold of his face. How perfect and foreign he was. How dangerous. This was the glistening forbidden apple. She kissed him, putting her fingers over his face, his eyes, over his ears, to his neck, to know him, to gather him in by touch. Obsession for Men, Calvin Klein.
And I was like, I didn't know the difference between top, middle, base notes and all that stuff. I just knew that it smelled really good. And then when I wore it, I felt confident, I felt, I felt like, I felt older. I felt mature. I felt intelligent. And then, I used to always get responses from people, oh, you smell so good. And I'm like, man, And so that became my thing, the guy who smelled good, because, no one kind of remembers what you wore, but they always remember how you smell. Always.
Exactly. It's an imprint on your memory.
Yes.
I love that. So early on, you were obsessed with Obsession.
Yes.
What about the Obsession fragrance? I know you said it just made you feel confident and that, you just dug it.
Yeah.
And you liked getting the compliments. But were you able to identify what about Obsession you liked?
I don't know. It was something about how smooth and musky the fragrance was. I know now why I did, but back then I had no clue, right? And then I started kind of diving deeper into like the whole world, and I was wearing like, the Tommy Hilfigers and the Ralph Laurens and the Fahrenheits and all that
Right.
kind of stuff, the Dior's. So that was my introduction. And then I kind of fell off this cliff of like, and back then when you were a collector, you had like, a few. Now the collectors, they have like, it's a whole different ball game. But I had so many, and that was my thing. In college, everywhere I went, it was like, oh, go smell them. You smell so good. So I try to explain that to people. It was literally and figuratively an obsession from the beginning.
Obsession.
Yes.
What do you think is a better compliment? You smell good or you look good?
Oh, hands down, you smell good.
Right?
Hands down.
Right?
It's not even close for me. Because my style is pretty simple. I mean, I don't like to kind of think about it. I mean, shout out to, the guys and girls who like really put their effort into fashion.
Yes.
But my effort is into like feeling good. And what makes me feel good is fragrance. And it's always been like that.
I love that.
Because what is fragrance? Fragrance, on this basic level is, these notes that come together to make something that smells really good. And, it's that on its,
at its base level.
On its base level. But what is it really? Right? It's like, I tell people, I don't make fragrance. I make confidence. I make romance. I make love.
Yes.
Because these things, like, they give you that feeling,
a feeling, a vibe. You create vibe.
Right. And I go back to that feeling that I had when I didn't have a whole lot of money to buy, clothes and all that stuff. That's how I want people to feel. And I also want people to, be free to be who they are, For a long time, going back to me, trying to hide that I was smart. For a long time, I used to kind of show or be who I thought other people thought I should be, right? And then the freest I've ever felt was to like say, I don't care. I'm just going to do and be myself. I'm going to, show whatever side of me that I kind of put away.
Right.
That I was afraid for people to see. And then I said, okay, no, this is me. This is it.
Well, what are some ways that you were able to feel that freedom for yourself? Like, what did you do to kind of feel like, how did you get there? How did you get to the point where you felt like you didn't have to hide who you were? And what were some of those things you did to express yourself?
Well, I got to a point where I said to myself, it doesn't matter if I show you who you want me to be or who I am. It's never going to make you happy. It's never going to make everyone happy.
Right.
So the thing that the most important thing is to make sure that you're happy. Right?
Yes.
So if you're happy, then that's the only way you're going to make everyone else. And listen, still people may not come around. Right?
That's true.
But I just felt like, being myself was honest. It's less stressful, right?
Ain't that the truth?
And it's a long journey to get there. I mean, you're still working through it, right? And I kind of have like, this kind of mysterious dark side, to me.
We have to explore that actually.
Happy to. But for a long time I tried to hide it. It was like, just be what society or what people want you to be. Don't show them that.
Like go with the status quo.
Go with the status quo. But now,
I think you're doing everything right. I mean, and you're also able to take something you're passionate about and share that passion with other people.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. So let's actually start talking about how you went from modeling to starting your own brand. So it's my understanding that you found yourself in France. I'm sure you bought a plane ticket and you got there with purpose, I'm sure. But you were in France and you were going to different fashion or you were going to different fragrance houses.
Right.
And just trying to find someone to work with you, right? Could you take me back to that moment?
So I had a mentor. I moved to London for a little bit, needed a little break from New York, and I had a mentor, and she was amazing. And one day we were talking, and she said, well, if there's anything else that you would want to do, what would that be? And I said, you know, I would love to create my own fragrance for me. Right. So she says, okay, well, let's see what that looks like. Let me put that down and see, you know, and okay, how do we do that? So I'm in France, I'm in Cannes, and I reach out to her, and then we always have these kind of like, talks and phone calls and like inspirational meetings. And she says, well, you know that Grasse, which is, arguably the birthplace of epicenter of fragrance, is 45 minutes away from where you are. And I said, really? Okay. So I'm going to go. So a friend of a friend let me borrow their car. And I just drove to Grasse with I had nowhere to go. I just wanted to just go and just see it.
Right.
And then I started seeing all these signs for fragrance houses. And I popped into a few of them. Some of them were warmer than others.
I'm sure.
Probably for many reasons. But I think the main reason was it's like, well, who are you? Like, who,
right.
like, what do you...
Who are you to create a fragrance?
Right. So I knew that in order for me to kind of really do this, I needed to stay there for a little bit and kind of learn the history of what is going on here.
Right.
And I mean, and there's some like historic fragrance houses from the 18th century. I mean, it's just like it goes back,
way back. Yeah.
Way back. And I needed to learn that in order for people to understand or take me seriously in the perfume world, because it is, the perfume world is very French, and being American and African American at that, it was going to be a tough road. So I said, okay, let me stay here. Let me meet, let me have conversations. A lot of the fragrance houses that I'm working with now weren't that enthusiastic about working with me because I hadn't proven myself. It was like, okay, well, So there was one house that said yes. And I would always be eternally grateful to them.
Wow. And that actually reminds me that, again, you're the son of two teachers.
Yeah.
So you didn't just go in there and say, oh, I'm going to do this. You're like, I'm going to be a student of the game.
Got to learn.
And you sought learning first.
Right.
It seems like to create your brand. So
yeah, I think we all should do that. I think in order for us to kind of take our own spin on whatever it is that we're doing, you need to know the origin of it.
Absolutely.
And then what you could do better and what your kind of stamp on whatever area or whatever you're doing is going to be. And I knew mine was going to be completely different because no one is ever going to tell a story that I'm going to tell.
Right.
Because no one's ever walked in my shoes, and vice versa. I would never be able to tell stories that other brand owners can tell. So it took me a while to kind of figure that out. Right. I didn't know where to start.
I don't think most people know where to start either,
right,
where they're going to create it, but you forged your own path. You went for it.
Well, the point is to start.
Take some sort of step.
Even if you don't know where to start, start. You're going to mess up. You're going to fail. You're going to do things wrong. I'm still doing all those things, but I'm doing more things right than I'm doing wrong, thank God. So things are, moving along. But in the beginning, I didn't know where to start. I didn't know, okay, so what is my first fragrance going to smell like? What is it going to be? What's going to be the name? And then that's when it all kind of dawned on me. Like literally at one moment, it just hit me. I know exactly what I'm going to do.
How did you know that? What got you there?
So fast forward to like 2004 or 5.
Well, when did you get to Grasse? When did you?
So this was like 2016.
Okay, so 2016, you're in Grasse.
Yeah,
and then you had this epiphany.
Right. So I went on my honeymoon. I'm now divorced, but I went on my honeymoon to Paris in 2004.
Oh.
So we stayed in the Bastille. So we stayed around the Place de Vosges, which is like the opera. So every morning we heard like this woman singing opera music outside the window. And there were all these art galleries like around the park.
Beautiful.
And I'm walking down one day, I'm walking by myself, and I see all these paintings of Harlem. And I'm like,
in France.
In Paris.
In Paris.
Specifically. And I'm like, why am I seeing all these photos of Harlem? Right? And then I realized that there is a very strong connection between the Harlem Renaissance in Paris.
Wow.
The Langston Hugheses, the Josephine Bakers, when they weren't accepted here,
that's where they went.
They said, we love you. Come here.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this like love affair between Harlem and Paris. And at the time, I was living in Harlem. So, you know, I was immersed into the culture. I love French culture. I said, my original story needs to tell that.
That connection.
And no one's ever told it.
Yes.
So I said,
I didn't know that.
Right. So I said, my first collection was called the Renaissance Collection. It was Danse, Sauvage, Renaissance, and Harlem Nights.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew that in order for me to kind of earn the respect of the French in the perfume world, telling that story would say, wow, we never realized how strong the connection was. And we definitely didn't realize that there was a connection between fragrance and that relationship. So that's when I decided to tell that story first.
Brilliant.
And it took off from there.
You helped to build a bridge between the epicenter of fragrance and where you were living at the time.
In Harlem.
Harlem. And it's a true story.
Yep.
It's part of your story.
Because it was already
their story.
Right. Because there was already a connection, just not through fragrance.
Through scent. Yes.
And then I said, okay, you know, what does that Harlem speakeasy smell like? And how do you create that essence? And that time when there were speakeasies in France, in Paris. So like, what does that smell like? What does that feel like? So it was amazing how that came to me, because I had to, in that moment, kind of like fly in my head all the way back to walking around that park.
Right.
And seeing those photos. And I said, okay, well, here's where I start. And then the rest is kind of, you know, me understanding who I was, what my brand was going to be, the identity of what it was, unapologetic. Here are the other stories that I want to tell.
Yes.
And
speaking of which, I know you call yourself a scent storyteller. It's one of my favorite phrases I've heard in the fragrance industry for a brand, because it truly is a full circle thing for you and your experience. So could you tell us a little bit what you mean just by being a scent storyteller? Because, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, there's a connection, or people don't know how fragrance is created, right? You studied it, so you know, I've been in the industry, so I know, but could you explore a little bit about that relationship between the chemist, the perfumer, you as a scent storyteller, and the customer? How does Danse Sauvage, Harlem Nights, and Renaissance Man get from the idea, the awesome idea you had, to market?
Well, it's funny because until that experience when I was in Grasse, I was just like the average person. I had no clue on how something started from an idea and then ended up in a bottle on the shelf. And that in itself was fascinating. And that's what grabbed me. That's what hooked me into this world.
The art.
Because in the art, the creative part of it, you know, whenever I'm working on something new, people ask me all the time, what's your favorite? And I always say, it's the next one. It's the one like that I haven't gotten yet, that I'm still trying to figure out. And there's another story to tell. And that is, I mean, there's so many different layers to business, but the creative part to me is one part that, you know, gets me up at 4 a.m, you know, up late at night, working on it, excited, you know, that feeling in your stomach that I always have. And it's never left since I launched my business. Um, but like you said, the relationship between me and the perfumer is very important because people assume that I'm the perfumer. I'm more of like the fragrance designer. The perfumer is the artist, is the magician.
Yes.
They are the chemists, the ones who take my ideas and bring it to life.
Right.
And we do work together. I mean, there is like
Hand in hand. Yeah.
hand in hand. I call it a
like a dynamic duo.
It's like a waltz. Like me and a perfumer, we need to dance, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes we step on each other's toes. Other times we are like...
It's part of the process.
Other times it's like we are dancing and it's like beautiful and you know, sometimes it just doesn't work. But most of the time it does work. And we start from one point and then we keep dancing together. Like maybe we should try this. Let's try that.
Yeah.
They're artists, so you can't just be like, you know, no. You have to say, listen.
It's like Erykah Badu said, remember, I'm an artist, so I'm sending out the shit.
That's right.
Yes.
And the perfumers, they need their flowers because they're artists as well. It's like, imagine me giving you an idea and say, now go paint it. That's exactly what they do.
Right, right.
Sometimes they get it right on the first try. We don't have to do any modifications. And you know, and you're in the perfume world.
Usually lots of mods.
Lots of mods. And so if I don't have a strong visceral feeling in the very beginning from the first modification, I go a completely different direction because sometimes you do so many mods, you forgot where you started.
Right.
And it's like,
get the story in the first
It's
place.
like, what are we doing? Right. So, I have a fragrance called African Rooibos. Amazing perfumer, Sidonie Lacasse. She's in Paris. And I told her the story that I wanted to tell, and she just got it.
Wow.
I didn't have to touch it. And it is maybe, arguably, one of my best sellers. And, you know, I didn't have to go back and forth and, you know, we didn't have to say, okay, well, let's fine tune this, let's move this up and down. So the relationship between me and the perfumer is very important. And I usually go back to the people that I dance well with.
Right. I love that. I love that. That's awesome. So you've also, in your scent storytelling, you've also said that your fragrances tap into places that may be taboo.
Yes.
And you've said it's okay to be who you are and not being afraid to express that is important to you.
Right.
You know, I really think that's beautiful. And we've talked about kind of the place of fragrance and expression, but now let's get to what you said was your dark and mysterious side. And is that maybe speaking to some of the taboos you're mentioning? What are some of those taboos and how can you express them through fragrance?
So I'm a Scorpio, and most of us have like this kind of dark side that we put away.
I know about y'all.
You know about us. Yeah. Usually when I tell people, they're like, oh, Lord.
I'm right next to you. I'm a Sag.
Okay.
I'm a day in. So
okay.
Partially.
So yeah, you got that, you know, darkness.
Yeah, a little
that
bit,
dark side. And you know, I feel like in order to kind of be myself, you know, because you know, I'm a super sexual being, and that's okay. And there's nothing wrong with that.
It's human.
It's human. You know, and I felt like, you know, some of the stories that I told with like Sweet Taboo was like, you know, be yourself, you know, express who you are, you know, embrace it, you know, because, you know, for a long time I tried to hide that part of me. And I said, let me create fragrances that make people feel more comfortable to open up.
So what is one of those fragrances that you really feel like speaks to a taboo that you were afraid before to express? And how did you manifest that in the scent? Was there a note or a structure?
So I use a lot of boozy notes in my fragrances because I love rums, cognac accords. I love kind of like dark, mysterious. Like if you walk into a room that had like wallpaper and like it was dark and had like a chandelier, I want people to feel like, not all of them, but those fragrances, and you're listening to jazz, and there's like, you have like a nice drink, and people in there are kind of sexy, that kind of atmosphere.
Sultry, you can feel it. Yeah.
That's the way I create fragrance. Even in my fresh scents, I still give it a little something.
Right.
I want it to feel, that there's, like a spice to it, something a little naughty. Yeah. Because, there are so many people that, you may believe that are just kind of like very, vanilla or not very exciting, very straight. Yeah. But they have this side of them that really wants to come out. And I think fragrances are kind of that, that enhancer to make people feel, man, I feel good today. Yeah, I feel sexy. I feel dangerous. I feel, like I'm a bad boy today. Autumn Rhythm, one of the fragrances, because I have a collection called Dark Romance Collection.
Right.
So Autumn Rhythm is like, so back when I was growing up, all my boys had motorcycles, but I wanted a Harley, right? I didn't want to
the OG, the classic.
Yeah, I didn't want to get like, the crotch rocket bike, because if everyone went right, I went left, but that's how I was.
Biker boys, more easy rider.
Right. I was like, I don't know, maybe I saw a film where, the leather jacket and, the Harley with the bars. So I created a fragrance that was leather, like what it would smell like if I was riding my motorcycle on a back road in the fall, right?
Love that. So
it's leathery, it's spicy, it's green. It's like how the air would smell in the fall, like in autumn. And maybe someone will wear that and feel like, I'm a bad boy today. I'm gonna put my leather jacket on and my sunglasses and go make it happen.
Right.
So,
make what happen?
Whatever it is.
Make it happen.
Make it happen.
It is different for everybody.
It's different for everybody.
But I think through the scent, you're kind of telling that story, and you're putting people in a place, like you're transporting someone to maybe a different side of themselves.
Right, because I had a very bad boy side of me as well, but I was afraid to show it.
Oh, your parents probably wouldn't have liked that.
No, but as I got older, I didn't care, because I was like, okay, But I feel like every single scent can do that. Or it can soften you, or it can make you feel more wild, or it can make you feel, more adventurous. It's different for everyone. You may smell it, it may do something different than if, I smelled it for the first time.
Right.
So.
I love that. I love the power of scent. To me, and it kind of speaks to your fashion background as well, because to me, when you're wearing a fragrance, it's like you're putting on a different piece of clothing, or you're putting on an accessory.
It's part of your wardrobe.
It's part of your wardrobe.
100%.
Scent is part of your wardrobe. Do you actually find, I wanted to ask you, do you find yourself switching up your scent based on how you want to feel that day, or how you are feeling that day?
It depends. Depends on where I'm at. Like, before I reach down and grab, sometimes I don't look. I just kind of just grab and just say,
blind
picking. Yeah. And then other times I'm like, you know what? Tonight I'm going to the Met Gala or something like that. I need to rock this one, because I need to, I need for people to get like a little feeling of sophistication, a little sexiness coming out of, whatever they smell, because people will smell you before they see you.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, they'll be looking for you. It's like, who is that?
Who is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, did you go to the Met Gala yesterday?
I didn't go yesterday, but I've been.
You've been to the Met Gala?
I've been, yeah.
I'm curious what fragrance you chose when you went to the Met
Gala.
That
was back in 2010. I wasn't even creating fragrance yet, so I don't remember, but I'm sure it was something,
something
deep
sultry,
and rich.
Deep, rich, represents you, but
maybe
also
like an oud, maybe something very woodsy.
Yeah.
Something with some vanilla animalic.
Next time you have a ticket, who would be.
Yes.
I'd be happy to go.
Let's go.
Yeah, let's do it.
I think Anna went to. I think it's time for me to come back.
Let's tell Anna. Yeah. Anna, if you're listening, first of all, thank you. But also, two people need tickets to the Met Gala. Don't forget about us.
Yeah, it's been a while.
I want to talk about that first set of 3 fragrances you have. 3 fragrances that are on the Scentbird platform. 3 fragrances I love so much.
Thank you.
Let's start with Harlem Nights.
Yeah.
So as you said before, this first collection was all about the connection between Harlem and Paris.
So Harlem Nights was the first fragrance I created in the Renaissance collection. And I wanted it to kind of be reminiscent of what a Harlem speakeasy in the 1920s smelled like. So during the Prohibition, by the way, my bottles are the shape of flasks, which was inspired by, the flasks that they used to hide the alcohol in when they were during the Prohibition, when they were going to these speakeasies. So I wanted to, I wanted this fragrance to kind of, be reminiscent of the booze that you would smell when you walked in, the woodsiness of like the furniture, kind of like the smoothness of the atmosphere, the aura, like the wallpaper, everything.
Right.
Whenever I thought about what that would smell like, it was exactly what we created. And it worked. It's, people love Harlem Nights. They love kind of the story that goes along with the fragrance.
Right.
Not a whole lot of people use rum, like a rum accord in the fragrance. So I felt like this was the time to do it. And people have, it's one of my best sellers. So
absolutely. I love that one as well.
Yeah.
What are some of the notes in Harlem Nights that helped you to capture that essence of the Harlem speakeasy in the 20s?
Well, like I said, the main note was rum, the rum accord. It's very boozy in the beginning. And then the orris, like a floral note, very smooth in the middle. And then the sandalwood and the cedar. And there's a little patchouli.
Yeah.
Whenever I smell the little edge, the patchouli isn't dirty, it's smooth. But when I think about like some of the wallpapers from in the speakeasies, for some reason patchouli was that note that said, okay, this one has to kind of be very prominent in the fragrance. So they came together well. And
it's a best loved fragrance. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So let's go through Danse Sauvage. I'm actually wearing it myself. It's my favorite from your Renaissance.
By the way.
Thank you. And I know that the story of Danse Sauvage is around Josephine Baker. We talked about this a little bit, but could you describe the fragrance itself, the inspiration, and some of the notes you used to create the fragrance?
So Danse Sauvage ended up being the second fragrance that I created, part of that collection. And I was always kind of in love with the story of Josephine Baker, the Black Venus.
Yeah.
Actually, that the Black Venus is what kind of encouraged me with my packaging design, if I can say that.
Yeah.
So my whole brand is it's black, and that kind of tells a story of being like mysterious and sophisticated. But then there's the rose gold. There's like the copper rose gold, which is the color of Venus, the Black Venus.
Oh.
And that's the love part. That's the light part, right? So there's a dichotomy of who I am. There's the dark side, the black, sophisticated, elegant, and there's the light. The love, the empathy, that's all the rose gold. And that come together, and that's who I am.
Yes.
So I expressed it through the packaging.
I love that.
And then telling the story of Josephine Baker, I wanted to create something. When she left Harlem and went to Paris in the 20s, they accepted her and her performance. They were like, well, she's beautiful, she's wild. We don't know what to take of this performance, but we're going to call it the Danse Sauvage, the Savage Dance.
Yes.
So I had to create something very sexy, very wild. I used another boozy note, cognac, a cognac accord, which gives it a nice boozy kind of edginess to it. And the cedarwood is very woodsy and fruity. There's a plum note in it that kind of rounds it out. And I think it came out fantastic. Another one of my best sellers. And Danse Sauvage was the second one I created.
Wow. I love the plum note in it. It makes it feel super rich and like you can bite into it. I don't know how to describe it other than it's like alluring and you just keep wanting more of it.
Yeah, it's slightly animalic, and I love gourmands. Either you feel like you can eat it or drink it. Don't eat it or drink it. But, you know, I love kind of the feel of like the booze and like of like coffee and, you know, sweet like vanilla, and there's vanilla in Danse Sauvage as well. So, yeah, most of my fragrances would kind of have that gourmand feel.
Right.
So
Without being too sweet either.
without being too sweet.
And
No.
I think maybe that's the kind of, I don't want to say alcohol because I don't mean like alcohol solution, but the boozy, as you
Right.
said, the booziness maybe cuts off the sweetness and makes it a little bit
Right.
more alluring gourmand instead of like
Right.
completely like a piece of cake.
Right. Imagine like having a glass of cognac and there's a cherry inside of it, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be so sweet, but the cherry gives it that sweetness from the fruit. So I don't like my fragrances to be too sweet, but I do like the animalism from certain things like Renaissance. Well,
Right.
in the beginning, I named it Renaissance Man, but I changed the name to Renaissance because the Renaissance is the rebirth of people. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman.
Right.
So I went from Renaissance Man to Renaissance. So Renaissance,
Inclusive.
right. So, you know, in the beginning, you know, I felt like I needed to make something for men,
Mhm.
but then I learned that I'm making fragrance for everyone. It
Right.
doesn't matter, you know, if you're a man, woman, you know, whatever. So I changed the name of it, but I did that in Renaissance because the Renaissance is French for the rebirth of something, you know, the reinvention of something. So I wanted to make it like fresh in a way, but I also wanted to give it like that gourmand feel. So we used ginger
Ooh.
to give it a little spice, and we used honey. So the honey,
Love that honey.
the honey is the note that gives it that sweetness, but it's animalic. It's not too sweet, but it's that, you know, it's textured. Like you can feel it, right?
Yes.
So the ginger and the honey work great together. There's a marine accord. Most people kind of try to stay away from marine accords, but I wanted it to feel like oceanic. I wanted it to feel like how you feel when you're near the ocean or in the ocean.
Yeah, like the
possibilities.
possibilities are endless.
Very vast,
Here.
very open.
Yes.
So yeah, Renaissance came out incredibly well, and those three fragrances, I think they dance well together.
Mhm.
You know, and mind you, this is my first collection.
Right. It's
So
your introduction.
it's my introduction. So I had to bring it.
Yes. You could not fail on the introduction.
No, not on the first ones, especially when you're entering into a space where, you know, your people are unfamiliar to you.
Mhm.
You had to bring it. And I think those three did it.
Don't think too deep.
Okay.
Just, you know, instinctively
go
what
with it.
comes to mind. Just go with it. Okay. So your first day of high school.
Books. Woodsy. I think of the way a library would smell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you actually studied. That's great.
Yes.
Okay. Your first time in a Ralph Lauren polo.
Oh. Fresh. Like a bergamot
I like
fragrance. Yeah.
the first time you saw yourself in a major campaign.
Oud. Very sophisticated, powerful moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Your first trip to Grasse.
Floral. All I remember is like everything from gardenia to patchoulis to it was like this onslaught of like sensory overload of fragrance that, you know, it was an incredible experience. I'll never forget again what it smelled like. You know, there are parts that kind of are fading the way it looks, but the way it smelled as soon as you enter into the village of Grasse, it's just mind blowing. So florals.
I love that. Let's see here. What about your first major retail deal with Chris Collins fragrances?
What does that smell like? Success.
What does money smell like?
Yeah. Yeah, it just smells like, I think I did an article once and, you know, I said, you know, different things have a scent. I think hustle has a scent. I think success has a scent. And it's different for everyone, you know. but to me, it's just something that just has an aura, and of accomplishment. With still ways to go.
More success, more accomplishment.
Yes.
We'd like more of that scent to keep coming.
Right.
The first time you felt like you were taking a big risk.
What does that smell like? That smells like Sweet Taboo to me. Sweet Taboo is a gourmand that's like very, it's like chocolate and coffee, and and the things that are taboo are the things that we're afraid of, or we think we are afraid of them. And one of the reasons why I created it is because I want people to ditch those taboos and not be afraid and take risks, and don't be afraid to fail, and the only way you can succeed is if you do try, is if you do put yourself out there. So I think that's what it smells like.
It smells like Sweet Taboo.
Yep.
What about the first time you felt like you were making history? Because you have.
Have I?
You have made history.
I have a fragrance called Lost in Paradise. One of my newest ones. And it just feels kind of, transportive.
Right.
And I think, in the midst of making history, I don't think you ever think about making history.
Right.
It's like when you go into like the great musicians of the world, when they went into the studio, they're like, I'm not going to make one of the greatest songs. I'm just going to make a great song.
Right.
And then whatever happens to the song, that's up to everyone else.
Everyone else. Right.
Right. So, I'm flattered. Thank you for saying that I'm making history, but
it's true. You're the first Black-owned fragrance brand.
Yep.
That's
and
sold in major retailers.
Yeah. So, and the story will be written later on, but in the moment, I'm just going to keep creating incredible scents and, transport people and, just keep going,
Thank you. Please do.
Yeah.
Please do keep going. Okay. Tell us what it smells like, or what it smelled like when you got your first crush, or your first crush. What does that smell like? You don't have to name names.
Lipstick. Yeah. Lipstick used to drive me crazy for some reason. I don't know why. Just the sight of it. And then, first kiss, I can taste it, and then I can smell it. My first crush, my first kiss was my first crush. So that smell, that reminded me of the lipstick she wore, and I can still smell it.
What?
Yeah.
Do you have any lipstick notes in your fragrance? I know some notes can get a little lipsticky. Have you ever put that first crush lipstick note in a fragrance?
Not yet, but now that I'm, talking about it, I think you're right. Certain notes give that lipstick feel. But I never went for it, but you never know.
Yeah. Could be another fragrance.
Could be.
What about the first time you felt daring?
Leather, like the autumn rhythm, getting on that bike and just like, I think I took my Harley down to Carolina, just got on the road and just rode.
You went from here to Carolina on your Harley?
On my Harley, yeah. Me and my buddy, we got on the bike and just started riding, and then we ended up in Florida. But, that's like, dare, go. Just figure it out. We didn't have a plan. We just did it. And you figure it out along the way.
Leather. So if we want to feel daring, we should try some leather notes.
At least yeah.
I'm going to try some.
Yeah.
Okay. My last one is the first time you felt free. Free to be who you are.
It was that obsession. That was the moment where, scent just made me feel confident, and, it was kind of outer body. I would never understand at the moment what it meant, but when I look back on it, it was the moment where I felt like I was free to be myself and free to kind of start. It didn't happen all at once, but kind of shedding, the shell and the layers and kind of saying, okay, this is who I am. And I hope we all get to that moment, you know. And I'm
Absolutely.
still, you know, we're all. It's like an evolution. You never want to get to a point and say, okay, well, I'm finished. I did it,
Mhm.
because that's when, you know, you always want to keep evolving, keep challenging yourself, keep trying to find that inner child or that person inside of you that's daring and adventurous and fearless.
Yeah.
Um, I think we all have it in there. We just got to tap into it, and you know, it's evolutionary, and you never get to the point. You just kind of have to keep going
Keep going.
to
Keep
find it.
searching for it.
Yeah.
Keep striving for it. You know, you've also spoken throughout our conversation today about wellness, like
Mm.
fragrance is wellness. The idea of doing things for yourself, taking care of yourself from those first moments of grooming
Mhm.
to, you know, following your passion. Um, and I know you've said it's a moving target, right?
Mhm.
But what would you say is your definition of a life well lived?
Wow, that is an incredible question. It'll be different for everyone, but I feel one of the main things that I try to do is live life without regret.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and again, that's different for everyone, but you know, never say, "Man, I wish I would have done that."
Yeah.
You know, or because fear is paralyzing. It could maybe, you know, make you hesitate into doing something that you always wanted to do.
Right.
Um, and I feel like um, find that find that thing that you're so excited about that you can't stop thinking about it. You know, it sometimes it takes time to find that. You know, um, people look at my life when I was in, you know, in fashion. I was modeling, like, oh, your life must have been so great, and I learned so much, and it was so incredible, and I traveled the world, and I met incredible people, but it wasn't that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until I found that thing where I felt like, okay, I have arrived. I know who I am. Um, that is the feeling that I pray everyone gets to.
Yes.
It didn't happen to me until my 40s,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then come to find out that thing was staring me in the face the whole time. I just wasn't looking for it,
Right.
right? And then when I opened my eyes, it was right there, you know, and you know, divine intervention. Everything worked itself. You're here for a certain reason. You're in
Mm-hmm.
Cannes to drive to Grasse for a certain reason. So that to me is like life. A life well lived is to find that thing that burns in your stomach and you can't stop thinking about, and you have the courage to just go for it. And if you fall on your face, so what? You've lived. That's living, because you've done it, because you tried it and you have no regrets. So go for it.
Go for it. I love it. You make me want to like get out of this seat and like bust out of here and find that thing.
Do it. Run.
I think fragrance has something to do with it for me, but that's a life well lived as
That's the
well.
life we'll live. Yeah.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you, Brittney. You're a very good interview. You brought some emotion out of me telling some stories that I never told before. So, yeah, I appreciate that.